Welcome to Climate Pioneers, our live interview series featuring the most ambitious innovators working to mitigate the climate crisis. I'm Heather Clancy, editor-at-large with GreenBiz. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll be turning this interview into coverage for the site, and I'll be taking audience questions along the way. So I welcome your feedback and get those questions coming in because I'll come to them later. Today's guest, I'm super thrilled to introduce Aileen Lerch. She leads sustainability at Allbirds, a B Corp that makes footwear and apparel with a focus on premium natural materials. She's responsible for the Allbirds sustainability strategy, which is called Flight Plan. And that includes targets to cut the company's per unit carbon emissions in half by 2025. That's just next year. And to near zero by 2030. Aileen, hi, welcome.
Hi, Heather. Great to be here. Excited to talk about all things climate and carbon, and very excited to be here.
And Allbirds.
And all
right? So three years ago, your company pledged to cut per product carbon footprint in half within 4 years. Okay, so we're pretty far in. You're aiming for net zero status by the end of the decade, as I mentioned. So give us a status report.
Yeah, so in 2021, that's when we finally released our flight plan, our sustainability strategy to the world. And what was really unique about us creating and the way that we created this strategy is really acknowledging that, sustainability means many different things to many different people. They're all really important. But we saw this opportunity for climate to really be a big focus for us. And so, it was really a moment of a lot of companies, and it's so exciting, have these far off commitments, but we also saw the need for very near term progress to be made and to have it developed in a very clear way. So when we developed the flight plan, we actually created 10 very specific targets across 3 strategic pillars: regenerative agriculture, renewable materials, and responsible energy. And so we modeled very specifically, if we hit these targets, that's how we can decarbonize our business. And from our baseline year, our product level average carbon footprint was 10. Last year, we brought it down to 7.1. So it's a 28% reduction that we achieved through using lower carbon materials, renewables in manufacturing, shifting air shipping to ocean shipping, reducing packaging weight. So all these small changes across the business, and we're really happy and proud about that being over half of the way towards our target of 2025. And also we, like you said, 2025, it's next year and still some final work to do, but very excited about the progress to date.
That's per pair of shoes, that number?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And is that that's an average, or are there certain shoes that are more or less than that?
Exactly. So it's our average carbon footprint. And the reason that we did that is so we could really focus on these initiatives, because there's obviously always going to be some noise about how much we produce or what types of styles. And so to your point, there was a point of time of making a lot of different apparel items or socks and underwear in addition to shoes, and all of those have very different impact areas and different opportunities to reduce. And so that's why we really hone in on that average product carbon footprint value, though predominantly our products are footwear, and so have focused a lot of the initiatives on the footwear space.
Okay. How do you use carbon offsets against those claims?
So when I'm talking about those claims, that 28% reduction from our baseline, that is purely based on initiatives and shifts that have happened in our operations and supply chain. So an example is reducing the weight of our packaging or shifting from air shipments to ocean. We actually have supported different carbon offset projects since 2019, when we established what's called the Allbirds Carbon Fund, essentially an internal carbon tax that sets aside money to support carbon offset projects as well as reductions in our supply chain. So ultimately believe that offsets and supporting those types of projects are a really important market-based mechanism. But when we're talking specifically about these reductions to our average product carbon footprint, that is not excluding offsets. It's really about initiatives that are happening within our supply chain, direct reduction initiatives.
Right. And just to a little more color on that offset, is that just for avoidance credits? Are you dabbling with carbon removal like many other companies right now, or?
We've actually done a mix across both avoidance and removals, as well as nature-based, as well as some that are in the like energy space. And so it's, obviously that's a very big topic, I feel like, in recent years. But we've been on the journey and are always looking to work with partners and find ways to support really meaningful projects across that spectrum.
Yeah. And you mentioned a word a moment ago that I want to bring up next, which is you talk about these things. Right? Allbirds is one of the few public companies that regularly highlights emissions as part of your earnings report. So I want to ask first, what metrics are highlighted and why those metrics?
Yeah, and I mean, I mentioned this earlier, right? Like sustainability means 10 different things to 10 different people, and there's so many metrics, and there's SASB and GRI and all of the alphabet soup of reporting frameworks. And we do report to a lot of those, SASB, TCFD, but we've really honed in, acknowledging that climate is really our focus and decarbonizing our business and our supply chain. A big focus of a metric for us is this annual average carbon footprint and tracking those reductions over time. So that is the one that we really tried to focus in on. We publish an annual report called everything has like bird and flight, names. So is our flight plans, our strategy. We have an annual flight status report. It's really focusing on that reduction to the average carbon footprint. We do include other key metrics that everyone is really used to seeing, scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, and looking at it in that way. But that piece around storytelling, communicating, really focusing on a metric has been the average carbon footprint.
So that metric stays the same quarter to quarter, like it's not something, or do you pick out highlights?
We calculate it on an annual basis, primarily looking at the annual, and that's where we set a lot of our we think about it a lot in terms of like leading and lagging indicators. So the average carbon footprint in a lot of ways is this lagging indicator that we calculate annually. Whereas we look, for example, on a quarterly basis at a lot of leading indicators such as what is the percentage being shipped by ocean versus air in that quarter, because that will have a direct relation. So we're looking at a lot of those that are more kind of tied to business functions and operations on a quarterly basis, and on the annual basis we're looking at the annual average carbon footprint.
So when those metrics, those quarterly ones, who gets to see those?
That's where we're mostly looking at that internally, and with the point of really, I mean, what's interesting about the flight plan strategy that we developed and target spanning across materials, manufacturing, transportation, the key thing is that it means that this work is happening across so many internal cross-functional teams. It's not just that I'm responsible or executing these initiatives. It's really about that partnership and that collaboration. So typically on a quarterly basis, when we're looking at that, it's along with that question of what does the next quarter look like, or what do 2 quarters away look like, so that we can influence and manage that alignment as we work towards these 5-year goals that sometimes can feel far away, but it's amazing that, we set them in 2021 and 2025 is just around the corner. So really, that time flies.
So what about the external narrative though? Like, how do you decide what you talk about? Like, again, I'll go back to that earnings call, which I find to be fascinating because you rarely hear anything on those calls. Like, what would get highlighted and why, and in an external?
Yeah, it's still really, we try to focus on, and it's kind of this balance that I think is the case for a lot of sustainability teams and professionals and businesses that are trying to emphasize sustainability, is how do we be comprehensive and complete in the data that we share, but also break it down into a bite-sized piece that is digestible and meaningful to people over time. And so that, I mean, you're asking also about investors, and I think a lot about also the broader external community, our customers, the suppliers that we work with. And it really is a balance where we want to talk about so many different environmental and social metrics, but we also know that it can be overwhelming to people. And it's hard to, we're in the early days as a society of making sense of a lot of this data. And so we've very much taken this approach of you can find very comprehensive data in things like our sustainability report or in other annual reports. But on that consistent basis, we really focus on this metric of average carbon footprint. And, I think there's a lot of discussion around that, right? I hear a lot of times like carbon tunnel vision or the idea of focusing too singularly on a single metric. And that's where we also try to zoom back out and say, no, we're actually looking at a lot of different initiatives and metrics across the business, but in an effort to make it accessible. We compare it a lot to like calories on food, right? You look at a calorie label and you're looking at a lot of different bits of information, but there's also a core metric that's a big indicator for you. So that's kind of the comparison that we think about often.
I want to get into the labels in a little bit more detail in a moment, but I want to ask you first, there's a lot of companies that are very skittish about having that kind of disclosure or making those kinds of claims or of tying value to sustainability. So how does Allbirds handle that?
I mean, the real response I would say right now is that like it's a very hard moment, right? I feel like there was this wave of several years of a lot of commitments being made, and then there's also a lot of fear right now, and people don't know where to get started. They're waiting for this day that, in theory, there will be perfect legislation and guidelines about how to calculate and how to communicate. And I really understand it, and I have a lot of empathy for it. For us, what's really been important to realize over time is that we need to be on this journey of progress and valuing progress over perfection. And with that, when we, for example, we label all of our products with our carbon footprint, and that concept scares a lot of people. And I really understand why. They either don't know how to get started, they're scared of communication risk. What we've really prioritized is transparency. And as we do it, sharing very detailed methodology, sharing the motivation of why we do this, which is notably to help consumers start to understand these metrics, but also for accountability, to help hold ourselves accountable to bring these numbers down over time. And so I think starting with that right intention and then also sharing very detailed information about the methodology is what's helped us be comfortable sharing that information publicly, as well as this recognition that it's going to evolve over time. Like this is not, I don't think that how we do things now will be how we do it in 3 years or 5 years. This is all changing very rapidly. So that's how we manage it. And then I'm really grateful for the journey we've been on. And I also have empathy and understand the very real blockers that people feel.
Yeah. So what's on those labels? What information am I going to find, and why those metrics?
Yeah, so all of our products since 2020 we've labeled with the carbon footprint, so the cradle to grave carbon footprint, which represents the climate impact kilograms carbon dioxide equivalent, so all greenhouse gases across materials, so the input materials for the product, manufacturing representing energy emissions associated with the production, transportation, so ocean shipping, air shipping, trucking around the world, the use phase. So for us, our shoes are washable, so we have assumptions around how often people wash their shoes over the product life, and then also end of life, so assumptions for what happens when people are done with the shoes. And it can get really into the nerdy details of all of that, and there's debate within all of it. But that is that full cradle to grave carbon footprint is what we communicate. And there is really a future that we'd like to share even more metrics and have better ways of quantifying and kind of a response to this idea of like carbon tunnel vision. Yes, there are other impacts that are important, water, chemicals, but we really wanted to focus first on even just trying to make this accessible to the average consumer, to help them start thinking about, carbon footprints like calories on food. And it's been, in some ways it's really impressive to see how that's scaled in the world. And in some ways it's very slow. I always feel really kind of inspired when I see companies across different industries that are doing something similar. Like Oatly comes to mind a lot, or Logitech actually does it on some of their mice and keyboards. And so we really, we're very intentional with, let's start with one metric and really be very comprehensive and thorough and try to make it accessible to people, always with that sight of, in the future, we'd like to share more information.
So you mentioned two other companies, and I'm actually aware of both of those. Do you work with those other companies, and do you share methodologies with them? I mean, are they doing it the same way as you? Are you doing it the same way as them? How do you?
One thing I love about the sustainability space in general is that it's incredibly collaborative. So in fact, some of the sustainability team members on both of those, like we did a panel together and had a great discussion. I mean, it's so interesting of, food and bev, footwear, and then electronics, all talking about a similar concept. So have had a lot of conversations. And I mean, I'm that nerdy person that anytime somebody shares a report or I'm in the details reading about their methodology, approach, where they want to go next. And so it's, I see a lot of collaboration. I think there's also a lot of space for more collaboration, and a very notable moment that we're in is a lot of companies who I've talked to who are doing amazing work but don't really talk about it externally. They're waiting for legislation. They're waiting for better guidelines about how to communicate what they're doing. And again, I understand that, but it also sometimes, I mean, this gets into a little bit of that, like greenwashing, green hushing conversation that comes up a lot lately. Of it also scares me a little. I think this is a moment that we need to celebrate wins, tell stories of progress, bring all different types of consumers and people in society along the journey with us. So yes, there's collaboration and a lot of communication, but I think there's also a lot of space for more of it.
Do you publish the methodology for this one? I know you published some others.
Yes.
So this is
we have. Okay. Yeah, on our website you can click, and it's on every style. It has the carbon footprint, and you can click and it explains, what is a carbon footprint? And then another link to a very nerdy document in the details. And sometimes I get, people reach out to me with, I noticed on page 5 of this that you said this. Can you tell more about it? And I'm always like, oh, great. I'm glad somebody's looking into the details too.
Well, as one nerd to another, thank you for that. Yeah. And I'm going to keep getting nerdier on this one. Right. So how are you using digital technology to, you mentioned like wanting to communicate about water, and maybe you want to talk about land use, or I know you're doing a lot with regenerative agriculture as an example. Are you going to expand what you can say with these labels with digital technology in any way?
Yeah, so one thing to note about how we've done this in the past actually is so when we in 2020 started labeling all of our products with their carbon footprint, there really weren't that many digital tools out there yet, or they were just getting started. And so how we actually do the quantification of the carbon footprint is we in the past we've had to collect information about our products from all these different Excel sheets. And then we had an Excel-based life cycle assessment tool that was third-party reviewed and that we have to manage, and support from consultants. And it was just a very manual process. There was a very kind of like pivotal moment and where we lifted our heads up and it was really like early 2022 and saying, it might be time to evolve. And how do we evolve in this moment? And it was driven by both internal and external changes. So some internal changes were things like, we're a relatively young company. We were making more products and we had more materials. It was very challenging to track data. We also had started rolling out it's called a product lifecycle management tool, PLM, very common in the footwear and apparel industry, to actually track product data in a digital, systematic way. So there were some internal shifts. There were also external shifts of seeing more legislation, more discussion around carbon emission data sets or environmental impact data sets. And at that same time, a lot more tools were being developed in like carbon software and other environmental indicator space. And so we did this really long review took almost 2 years, talking to other brands, demoing tools, and ultimately selected a new carbon software. It's called Carbon Fact. And it's something that I'm really excited about in terms of, yeah, to your question, like a digital tool, because what happens, and I think what's happened really until the last few years, is a lot of sustainability teams' time was spent on like tool development and working with consultants to do third-party reviews and build out these things, and just very manual. When at the end of the day, what our jobs need to be is, I want to use effective tools that then help me develop strategies, develop initiatives, integrate them into cross-functional business processes, advocate for why certain changes have certain resulting impacts. And so I'm very excited about, the adoption of digital tools and seeing it across the industry, both for the sake of time efficiency and also being able to actually scale to different environmental indicators in a systematic way. We always wanted to do, not just carbon, but expand and have really effective modeling across indicators. But it was hard and it was manual and very time consuming. So that's an opportunity that I see with a lot of these softwares coming up. And I also, we have kind of this history of open sourcing and wanting to share learnings with the industry. And I think this is obviously a little different in terms of it's, different entities developing and providing softwares, but in a way that's helping sustainability teams have this scalable solution. They don't need to build bespoke tools. Like, let's get to the actual work rather than having to build tools at every single company.
Amen to that. I'm sure many people would say. That 2 years to evaluate that. So who was involved? Can you get a little bit more detailed about what it took to find that software?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the span of looking at, different carbon software solutions over basically 2 years, I really led that charge as the main user of the tools.
Okay.
So, I had developed that Excel tool, been the main user, and then also planned to be really like a primary user of this tool. However, especially in the case of a software solution, we needed a lot of internal collaboration. And a very interesting one that's been such an incredible learning journey is actually our technology team. So like software engineers, product managers.
Yeah.
And, I can pick a carbon software or a different software solution, but then there's a whole question of how do I get the internal buy-in to actually implement it and have it flow so that data structures at the company work, and that's not my area of expertise. That's the tech team. So they were a really important kind of partner in that. And I was very lucky to have some amazing partners with that. But also, other internal teams like legal, as we make these claims, they have to have an understanding. Marketing, communications, brand. Since we're a company that's focused on climate, have been focused on communicating these carbon footprints, a different solution has an impact there. So they need to be brought along the very nerdy journey of this, as it's a key part of our brand and our storytelling. Finance even, right? This is a budget line item of a software. So it was I was very much leading it and in the nitty gritty, but a great experience in bringing cross-functional teams along on the journey.
So how do Allbirds employees use this? Like, can anyone use this software, or does everyone use it?
So right now we're in the implementation phase, still a lot of these data flows. And, everyone has slightly different visions, I think, for how this will unfold. But for me right now, I actually see, like I talk to other people at brands and they say, oh, I want a tool today that my designers use and that my developers use, and they can go in the tool and adjust these different things. And I actually have a slightly different point of view. Like right now, I think it's actually a moment where, again, it's early, and that's my goal for what things look like in, maybe 5 years. But right now, even sustainability teams are grappling with understanding how to use these tools to set initiatives to decarbonize, bring them into their business. So I actually see it as a tool that I will predominantly use it to help simplify concepts and integrate it into our business processes. So like an example of more tactically what that looks like, I often think about a lot of this work actually very similar to costing throughout the design and development process, especially because we have a very specific carbon footprint metric. It's like, how do we look at it at different prototype stages? Businesses are very used to looking at costing each time that they're developing a product, understanding cost of goods, margin. How do we integrate sustainability metrics into those same decision moments? And this is really, why we developed the flight plan. How do we, it can sometimes feel like there's infinite initiatives that can happen at a company, but that's usually not the case. It's usually actually, hey, there's a core material we use in a lot of styles. If we switched the material from this to this would be the impact. How do I collaborate with the materials team to help make that happen? Or, I noticed that we're air shipping a lot of products in this specific use case. How do we transition that? So I love the vision of, maybe 5 years from now that everyone is in this carbon software or it's integrated and they're playing around with modeling reduction scenarios. But right now, I think it's more of a moment of sustainability teams using these tools and figuring out how to strategically integrate initiatives into the business function.
Okay, so I'm going to have to get back to you on that one, right?
Yeah, we'll see how it goes in a minute.
Right?
Years.
So your average footprint, no pun intended, is already way below the industry average, which is, I think, like 14 kilograms per pair or something like that. You are trying to get to zero, and you have done so with this prototype that you have for a project called Moonshot. So you have this whole idea of creating a shoe with no carbon footprint. You introduced a prototype last year in March. Give us a project report. It was for the wool runner specifically. What happened? What's going on with that product?
Yeah, so last year we announced it's called Moonshot, and it was a project that was a culmination of our work since day one. We've been on this journey of focusing on climate from the start, and so yes, we started with creating a lot of products that were lower than an industry average, which to some degree is hard to explain exactly what the average is when there's so little data in the industry.
Right.
But
okay.
There was always this question of how do we reduce and how low can we go? I would say that there was a collaboration we actually did with Adidas in 2021 to try to create, two footwear brands partnering together to create this lowest carbon footprint shoe at the time. And I would say that kind of, it was a really impressive collaboration, and it really supercharged a lot of people of, can we do zero? And what does that look like? What does that mean? Is it even possible? And the work really started in earnest like 2 years ago. And looking at that carbon footprint across the materials, manufacturing, transportation, use, end of life, we knew that we needed to reduce all the phases as much as possible. But to achieve net zero, there has to be something that is negative, right? There's always going to be some residual emissions. So what could be negative? And where a lot of our impact lies, as well as a lot of opportunity, is our materials. And so we announced this Moonshot shoe last year, and it really features these 3 carbon negative hero materials: wool from a regenerative farm in New Zealand, Lake Hawea Station, and this farm actually sequesters more carbon than it emits, a very high bio content sugarcane based foam, and then a methane capture bioplastic. And so last year we announced this, and it will actually be coming out later this year in the fall. And it's been this really interesting journey of, how do we actually design a shoe with this very hyper-focused goal in mind? How do we look to partners and utilize new solutions, bring them into the footwear industry? And ultimately, how do we communicate it as well? So when we announced it last year, we're now basically in the moment of production
yeah.
and sending it out there for a fall release. And it's also been very great to have this amount of time to constantly learn, how do we actually communicate this to people? And there's some, because I am nerdy in the methodologies also, like there's some different approaches of, we're recognizing the carbon sequestration that's happening on this wool farm because we believe it's a better representation of what's actually happening in the supply chain. there's all these nerdy details, but ultimately to, just everyone in our society, how do we also make this an object of desire and something that is exciting and that people feel inspired by or proud of or just like the look of, and then they learn a little bit more. So I would say over the last year, obviously production is challenging and is a whole exercise, but the communication piece has also been a really big learning experience for us.
What's challenging about the production? Is it the costs? Is it how do you get the line to handle it? What's hard?
One of the biggest, and this is also kind of like what keeps me up at night related to projects and solutions like this. One of the hardest things is how do you actually like bring bespoke materials and unique materials into your everyday production, and how do you do that at scale? And so, with this product, we kind of, it was wool from a very specific farm in New Zealand. The timelines to source that, bring it all through your supply chain are very long. Some of these very specific materials that are not default ones that footwear brands are using. That's the piece that's really interesting is, we've created this Moonshot project and we're figuring out how to communicate and share that story. The thing that keeps me up though is how do we scale it, right? Because it's not just about this product, it's about scaling the solutions to our business, scaling it across our industry to other industries, which is why we open sourced, call it the recipe book for Moonshot with some of the solutions. But ultimately, I think what was really unique is the Moonshot shoe. I see a lot of times companies across industries, they'll release like one sustainable product that's kind of unrelated to the other things that they do, or it's not directly tied to their initiatives. Moonshot was really unique that everything that we used to create it and that was special about it are directly tied to our flight plan targets. So scaling up regenerative wool, improving, scaling renewables to our manufacturing, lower carbon ocean shipping options. So it was, in some ways, it's coming out in the fall and, the project will happen, but it's also how do we keep scaling it and keep helping those solutions scale across industries.
Okay, that plays really well into an audience question I want to get to here. How is production volume considered in Allbirds climate reduction targets? For example, if you have company targets to double sales by 2030.
So the average carbon footprint that I was talking about earlier, that's basically normalizing the emissions by units produced. And so we set that target because we know that there will be fluctuations over time in the amount of production. So that 2025 target, that near-term target, was hyper-focused on the average carbon footprint. We also have set a science-based target for 2030 that's for absolute emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, aligned with 1.5 degree trajectory. So it's to bring down our absolute emissions 42% from a 2020 baseline. Lots of numbers, I know. But all that to say is that for that 2025 target, we realized as a young brand, we didn't actually know what production would look like, and let's keep hyper-focused on the average carbon footprint. But when we looked at 2030, regardless of what sales happens or production happens, we set an absolute emissions reduction target because we know that, that's what the world needs, and we need to hit that target. And so, if we produce more, we have to decarbonize more aggressively. And that's something that, while the 2025 target we set was very clear exactly what we need to do, we have ideas and generally know for 2030, but there's also a lot of changes that need to happen at a societal and industry level.
All right, another specific one. Are methane emissions from sheep farms included in your emissions calculation? And if not, why?
Yes, so the average the carbon footprints that I was sharing, it's kilograms carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's carbon dioxide as well as methane, as well as other greenhouse gases that occur with fertilizers if they happen, or other emissions. So yes, methane from sheep is included in it.
I'm going to stick with the sheep questions here, or the wool questions. Love to hear about the New Zealand farm wool. Any chance you would be able to work with US based wool producers who have excess wool but currently lack a streamlined market pipeline?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I guess I'll just share a little bit also about our like New Zealand connections and how that came about, but also what the future could look like. So one of our co-founders is from New Zealand originally, and that's kind of where we got the roots as a brand. And the first shoe was the Wool Runner, very novel to bring wool, natural material to shoes. And I actually, right when I started at Allbirds, within the first like month, went down to New Zealand and actually got to see the farms and do some soil carbon workshops with other brands that use wool, local scientists, local policymakers. So we've kind of had this very deep connection to New Zealand wool from the very start of the company, and that's why we were, in the case of Moonshot, we had a lot of those connections. Wool, I feel like, has become a more interesting topic over the last few years. I feel like I hear more and more brands that are exploring it as a fiber. Incredible fiber, has great characteristics, and ultimately a lot of our work and collaboration has happened in New Zealand because that's where we started and have really strong roots and partnerships, which are required when you're working on things like agriculture and land. But at the end of the day, we're very open to hearing other solutions and other global regions, and it's something that it's always interesting to see what is popping up around the world. It's just that we kind of had those roots and long-standing relationships that have helped get us to this point.
All right, I'm going to go to another question that I also had. How are you thinking about product end of life in context of 2025 and 2030 goals?
It's a great question. So end of life, we do include the end of life emissions in our quantification of carbon footprint and in our goals. At the end of the day, end of life, I think, is a really challenging topic for not just us, but is really this like industry-wide and societal-wide topic that needs really massive solutions. I always love and always reference the Ellen MacArthur like butterfly diagram. So thinking about inputs that go in and how are you supporting sources and developing products with those. And then on the right side of the diagram is kind of like, how do you think about extending the life of the products, durability, repair, keeping them in circulation? And then at the way end, how do you think about recycling or what happens to the materials at end of life? And, to be honest, like we do some of these around durability. We have a secondhand marketplace called Allbirds Rerun. The end of life of, what happens when the product is absolutely done is a really hard one. And I've been, interested and kind of excited to see what happens with a lot of brands that kind of do these individual products of like, send us this back and we'll upcycle it or make it into something new. I'm curious to see how those unfold, but I really see it as an area that we need industry and societal shifts and solutions to occur. And so that's always a quick one where I kind of raise my hand and I'm like, we need help on that one. That's one that I don't have all the answers. I have a lot of questions and I understand a lot of the barriers, but it's one we need to collaborate and very open to help and ideas on, because it's a hard one.
I need to learn more about Rerun because I don't think I knew about that. And we could explore that a lot longer, but I'm starting to get worried about the clock here and I have more questions. So here's one I think that I find fascinating. How much do you work on measured versus modeled carbon? So like, in other words, how do you balance measured versus modeled in carbon footprinting?
I like the main, I always like to take a step back and I'm like, why do we even measure these carbon footprints, or why do we measure any of these indicators? The key reason is so that we can understand hotspot areas and actions that we can take to make change. Like that is the whole reason. In some cases, like I'm like, who cares what the number is? How do we reduce it? And how do we identify an initiative to reduce it? So we did spend a lot of time up front of building out models and figuring out how to actually get data and translate it and calculate all these emissions. Now I'm in a point where it's really about how do I understand what solutions or initiatives are feasible at the business level? How do I model what that resulting reduction would be? And then how do I gain alignment internally? Or if there's blockers or solutions needed, how do we go out into the industry, go to partners and figure out how to collaborate on that? So a long way of saying, like, initially it was a lot around wrapping our heads around the measurement, figuring out areas that were hotspots. Now we're very much in an area of we do this because we want to improve and make changes and make progress, and let's focus on that. So it's been a bit of a journey.
Okay. Totally different topic. How much do you consider biodiversity as part of your flight plan?
I would say that with our flight plan, so I mentioned we have these 3 strategic pillars that help us achieve our carbon reduction goals: regenerative agriculture, renewable materials, responsible energy. We've really mostly focused on biodiversity through the regenerative agriculture pillar. We've been partnering a lot with our supplier, New Zealand Merino, based in New Zealand. And it's I'm really excited of what the kind of future of nature and biodiversity as indicators in businesses look like. I've been following all the more alphabet soup of, SBTN, TNFD, thinking about how to capture all of that. But it's for us, it's mostly been through the context of supporting shifts to regenerative in our wool supply chain. And there's some great frameworks, and our partners have developed very bespoke models looking at the New Zealand context of how do we track and acknowledge biodiversity changes through shifts in practice. But that's one that sometimes it can feel like the early days of climate work, and I think biodiversity in nature is even earlier, and we have to see kind of how those standards and actions continue, but very excited about that.
There is a question here about how you measure. So for the New Zealand farm and other regen ag partners, how are you approaching ongoing monitoring, reporting, and verification, and the permanence of the impacts?
Yeah, great question. I think there's really a few nestled in there, so I'll try to keep it kind of brief. The one thing about regenerative that we really acknowledge is that also means 10 different things to 10 different people. And if you look at different contexts, it can be defined in many different ways. Oftentimes, that's where we look to our partners, right? I'm actually probably not the best person to develop a framework for how to do ongoing monitoring for wool farms in New Zealand. Our partners in New Zealand are. And so that's where we really, we were brought along the journey of the development and collaborate on that. But also it's a space where I recognize who are the partners that we can really lean on and have the closest connection. There was also a question around kind of permanence, and I assume that's, referring to thinking about carbon sequestered. Yeah. And so that's, again, we're looking with our partners where they're working so closely. In the wool context, they're working really closely with all these farms and figuring out best practices in monitoring, verification. The world of soil and land is very complicated. Soil samples, there's all new technologies now for better monitoring of kind of field and land cover. So it's, I would say the shortest answer is really collaborating and leaning on partners, but also we've developed a lot of our own learnings about permanence and additionality and all those key attributes over time. So also always bringing forth our questions and making sure that we have them answered in the methodologies.
Good. The questions got really active. You promised to stay with me until about now. Do you have a few more minutes for some of these questions? You want to hang out a little bit more?
Yeah, it sounds great.
Okay. Good. Yeah, just all of a sudden, boom. Okay, so let's let's be as succinct as possible.
Great.
Okay, so real quick one. I'm curious to know if you know of other brands who have used your open source information to develop net zero products. So the methodologies you've published, do you know of other brands?
We have been in a lot of communication with brands who have, used the resources, and we share and swap stories. I don't yet know of anyone that's very specifically created a net zero product using it, but it's definitely resulted in a lot of great conversations and ongoing collaboration points.
As a big fan of Allbirds and a sustainability pivoter, I'm curious what talent was involved in the development of Moonshot? What kind of skills, soft or technical, were useful in the project?
My answer here is just like everyone.
Everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was an incredible cross-functional process. Designers, materials developer, product developers, communications, legal, like finance, everyone was involved. And that's something that this is like a quick plug of just as a fan of the work that like Drawdown Labs does. And they've been working on these like function guides of helping different functions at a company understand the role that they can play in climate action. And I'm just a very big believer that, I mean, it's really impressive that every role at a company has an opportunity to impact work in a different way. So maybe a little bit of a like cop out answer, but everyone
Okay.
and all types of roles.
Okay. So, and I'll make a plug for the story I did about Moonshot last year. It has a pretty detailed talk through about how the project got handled. Couple others here. Has Allbirds considered setting a target with SBTI? If so, why didn't you go with it? If not, why not?
We do have a target with SBTI. So we've set a 2030 absolute reduction from a 2020 baseline aligned with 1.5
Yeah.
trajectory.
So that's a very specific target. It's not like the corporate net zero thing.
No, it's
Right. It's just a specific
reduction. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Got it. Let's see. One other question here. For young sustainability analysts, how did you learn the ins and outs that allow you to complete these nerdy calculations? Advice for diving into the data?
Oh, that's a really great question. I mean, I think that it's a different moment right now. There's a lot more like online courses and different learning opportunities that I see that I'm like, wow, I wish that existed 10 years ago. It would have been really helpful. So I think there are a lot of online learning opportunities that seem really impressive now. Ultimately, like one of the biggest things that I've learned is how important it is to just talk to people, peers at other companies, see what they're doing, see what their challenges are. I've learned a lot from peers across different companies, and at the end of the day, rolling up your sleeves and just getting started on something, iterating over time.
The last few questions I have are, let's keep them succinct, and they're kind of along the same vein. I made them up though. So who's on your recurring meeting list and why?
Internally, our designers, developers, communications, legal. I'm always like the biggest fan of legal, which is maybe people don't always expect, but love collaborating with all of them. And then also external, like partners in our supply chain, like our wool supplier, technology partners, Carbon Fact, the carbon software solution, and then also a lot of, again, industry peers, people outside of the footwear and apparel industry. I definitely learned so much from relationships with people across different companies and industries.
Who do you seek out for mentorship or a reality check on an idea?
Mentorship, I would say, a lot of people at Allbirds in the company, as well as past coworkers who've now gone to different industries. That's, I look to other industries a lot and try to get guidance from friends and past colleagues. The reality check, I realize sometimes like I can live in a bubble of all of this work, and so I'm very quick to also go and talk to friends or family members that don't really know anything about this and say, oh, if I told you we're making Moonshot, a net zero carbon footprint shoe, like, what do you think that means? And it's a great reality check of, we can have our conversations that get quite detailed in this space, and remembering that there's a very diverse group of people in our society that have very different levels of understanding about this information.
How do you manage eco anxiety?
There's a quote that I like read many days and I always come back to a lot. It was Amory Lovins, who's one of the founders of RMI, said this, but it talks about the concept of applied hope, and how kind of like starting with hope and acting out of hope creates this virtual cycle of having something to be hopeful about. And also, very specifically, it's not hope in some abstract, far off way, but the idea of applied hope is a very like tangible opportunity to integrate work into our decisions every day. So I think about, I dream about the future a lot, but I also just think about, what I can do every day and what little decision can be made or little thing that I can say, how that can unfold, and go for long walks too. Like nice long walks in nature are great to help any anxiety.
That feels like a really good place to leave it. I really appreciate your time, Aileen. It's great to catch up with you, and it's really great to hear about what you're doing. I'm looking forward to seeing those shoes in actual stores.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you also to the audience for some great questions. Really appreciate your engagement. I'll be back next month with our next interview, and that'll be focusing on buildings. So a very big buildings materials supplier, one of our good friends, Eunice Heath, who is now with CRH. So watch for that registration. Meanwhile, thank you so much for being with us, and I'm going to do a sign out. Take care. Be well.
Thanks, Heather.